Welcome to the Intellectual Anarchy podcast. I'm Patrick Sullivan.
And I'm Catherine Cruz, and I'm just a curious cat.
Defeating geography is really about defeating the thing that keeps us from moving forward.
Okay.
And it's one of the most important things that I think affects a place like Hawaii. Because if you go back in history, for example, the U.S. transportation was by rivers and waterways, right? I mean, Venice was built on waterways. And then you had horses and buggies, and then you had cars, right? So the interstate highway totally changed the economics and created opportunities all over the U.S. And then you have air transportation, which became part of the opening of Hawaii, a place like Hawaii with wide-body aircraft that could fly all over the world, which, except for doors flying off on things like Alaska Air, is pretty reliable. They're just like buses. They fly constantly. They go anywhere. And so where you used to have to take a boat to a place like Hawaii, or you used to have to take a donkey to cut across, from Nebraska to Colorado. You can take a highway, you can take an airplane, you can do all kinds of things. So transportation killed a lot of those geographic boundaries and connected communities and created economic opportunity. The interesting thing about Hawaii is because we're surrounded by water, we still are locked in the idea that we're really isolated. But the truth is, we're really not. Because whether you're in California or New York or Texas or Houston, or you're going to fly. And everywhere you're going to go, you're going to fly, pretty much, if you're working in the professional, creative, tech, any of those things. And that means it's almost irrelevant where you physically have a home as much as it is that you're willing to get on an airplane.
Well, okay, but given that we've just come out of the pandemic and everybody's zooming in, I mean, it would seem like then that even removes that barrier.
That's one of the last real proof points, because we've been doing working connected over a long time already with our own versions of video conferencing, but companies like Zoom made it easy, simple, accessible, affordable, and routine. And it's just routine now. So the whole challenge with these big cities that focused on offices are predicated around the idea of geography, whereas Zoom is saying, well, not really. And so they're repurposing a lot of these major city offices into residential spaces because office space is no longer the thing driving it. There still is a need to have offices in here. Of course, there's a need to have labs. But does everybody need to be in there every day from 8 to 5? Not really. Certain times they do, and you got to spend time together, and you're trying to maintain the culture, and those are really important things. But the physical attributes of sitting in proximity every single day are less important, and you see it everywhere in all aspects of business now. And so that's the last kind of proof point if people were wondering, like, well, what do you mean? Because from my perspective, Zoom has made geography given it a backseat to a lot of things. So, for example, we're working with Department of Energy. So it's in Constitution Avenue there in D.C. But the guys that used to be in headquarters during the pandemic moved to one guy we're working with is in Arizona. And he tells me, I'm not moving back. He came out of headquarters. I don't know how they're going to do this because he is headquarters, which is in D.C. But he moved his whole family. And you got another guy we're working with who is in Oklahoma. He said, I only go there when I have to because I just don't like being there. I'd rather be in Oklahoma. And for these people, they've made it their homes. And they're still senior leaders in a major institution and available just like any other time, except now you may talk to them on Zoom, and it might even be more easy than it used to be going in to sit with them, because now they can have a little more flexibility, I think, and that's what I'm picking up from them. It's, instead of an 8 to 5, they lock the doors at 5 kind of thing. It's like, yeah, I got a long lunch coming up. Why don't you call me at 6? Because I'm going to, let's do that. So people are working different hours to get their job done because they're Zooming. And Zoom provides this human-like experience. It's not fully in person, but you get a lot of nuanced communication from looking at people when they're speaking. And I think we're kind of built as a species to communicate in these multidimensional ways.
And so how do you see then, defining jobs in a particular place if a lot of those issues are starting to fall away?
Well, there's a few things. First, there's the idea of where do you want to live? Where would you like to live? And I think for educated people with an education, they have more options. But then comes this question of who do you like to hang around with? And that adds another dimension to it, because having some level of interaction can make work a lot more fun. Just the human connection. And I think that's still vitally important, but the way we connect may change. But bottom line is, if you have transportation, electricity, and broadband, you can live anywhere. So as long as you can meet your personal and accessible needs, you can pretty much do it anywhere. Now, in our case, we have labs, physical plant facilities where people need to use a scanning electron microscope, or they need to use, equipment to do testing, do crazy experiments. Well, we've assembled all this gear so that people can use it. And it's not the only place to have it, of course. You can have it. We have gear in for example, in Houston and in other places. But if you want to do an experiment and you need access to a facility or a specific environment or something, you've got to physically be in proximity of it.
You got to come into the office.
Right. So you've got that piece too. And so those still add some rudder to how you're going to work. But it depends on the job. So broadband, for example, becomes table stakes for anybody in the future, connected with adequate connectivity so that you can talk to people, share data, share human experiences, interact, all kinds of things. It's the super highway to the world. And so you could be in a remote island if you've got access and you work well with all kinds of people. So we have people, for example, who are, I would call them retired, maybe semi-retired, but they might live in a more isolated place, say on Kauai. But, they come in periodically. They're on meetings when they need to be. They do the work when they need to. They interact when they need to. They're not so much in the lab anymore. And they've got a lot of really good knowledge. And so they may choose to live in a place, but continue with the relationships they have and then augment those relationships with periodic physical presence. We've found, for example, a rule of thumb is once a quarter. Once a quarter, it's good to come in and hang out with people. And so we have people in all kinds of locations around the country now. And that's kind of what I tell them. I say, once a quarter, show up, spend some time with people, go get lunch, make sure we all are communicating and understanding. And then when they're working out of, pick a place, it doesn't matter as long as they're connected and they do their job. So there's that tempo of connectivity that's needed, and we're kind of experimenting with it. But I would say for starters, once a quarter works for a lot of people. But these are generally people with a lot of experience, years and years of working, a lot of knowledge, and they kind of get it. If you take a really young person, they're still learning their way around and how to work with people and how to work as a professional and how to do things. And so that mentoring that comes from being in physical presence, I think, helps a lot.
How do you deal with deadlines?
Deadlines are deadlines. So we set deadlines, and then there's alibis and excuses, right? The dog ate my paper, but we have to hold people to deadlines. So we really try to do that. Most people do that.
So you build in the flexibility, but then you just say, yeah, it's got to be 8 by 5 or.
Yeah, and so here's a way to look at it. We've experimented with this over the years. So early on at Oceanit, we were, we operated more a flatter organization. So a lot of the industrial revolution businesses are very command and control, very vertically integrated, right? So the military is very vertically integrated, right? The guy's at the bottom and the one guy at the top, and he dictates and everybody salutes and goes down and gets it done. So that's an idea that was built, works for certain kinds of industries. For certain kinds of industrial mass production types of things, it works fine. In a knowledge economy, our opinion and our experience is, flatter works better. You still need a little bit of vertical stratification and management. Like, so who do I ask if I got a question? Who makes a final decision? But if you have highly educated people, just like you kind of hear this in the military of creating highly capable special forces, small groups go out and do things, all very capable, all empowered to do things. Those teams are like super, we call them high performance teams. So we found that if you have highly educated people, a lot of them enjoy these more flat organizations. But what happens is, whereas a vertical organization, the discipline is imposed from the outside. In a horizontal organization, the discipline is imposed from the inside. So for example, if you don't have any self-discipline, you're not going to make it in a horizontal organization because you're going to miss a deadline. And after you say the dog ate my paper a couple times, people are going to say, look, I can't trust this guy. Whereas if people learn they can count on you and you do what you say, they don't care physically if they happen to see you that day as long as you got it done.
Right, just don't flake out.
Just don't flake out. That's it. So in a horizontal organization, which is what we have really at Oceanit, we trust people, and there's a reciprocating trust that comes back that builds this bond of how people work together. But that's really important when you're creating ideas based on highly educated people that are thinking in innovative terms and working in these collaborative teams, these smaller high-performance groups that kind of form and then reform and then reform. And when they do, they may improvise and it's like playing jazz, produce something and then dissipate and go on and do something else. So we do a bunch of that here, but people have to have that self-discipline. If they don't fit. It isn't a good fit. And so a command and control organization is good for the people that need that external discipline that says, start here, end here, follow this, and exactly what to do. Whereas here, we're empowering people to think. So the thing that differentiates a vertically stratified versus a horizontal organization, I've often thought, is discipline, either externally imposed or internally provided.
So, what is geographic determinism? I don't really know what that is.
Well, it's this term that geography sets the stage of what you're able to do, and that is a common concept that's embraced by lots of economists, professional economists. There's a really good guy, Enrico Moretti, I think is his last name, a professor at Berkeley who wrote a book called The New Geography of Jobs. The geography of jobs, I think, has a pedigree that goes to in extractive economies, in neoclassical economic models where I'm mining coal, I need to be by a coal mine. I'm chopping timber, I need to be by a forest. And that geographic proximity is the opportunity because you're harvesting some natural resource. And then you've got the next version of that is there's a big company here and we all work around that company. So the company makes cars in an assembly line and we got all these people around the car company. They make parts and provide lunches and do all kinds of things. In this, I think, economy based on innovation and highly educated people, geography is really not the limiting issue. It's people, that are educated. It's accessed, broadband, transportation, electricity. But it isn't that if you move outside that cluster, there's nothing for you. Now, it may be that you want to move to the middle of someplace in Oklahoma where there's no people. That's rough because, if you don't know anybody to talk to and you're trying to work with a team and there's no team to work with, well, of course, that's an extreme example. But for the most part, you've got great universities and colleges around the country that produce STEM-educated people, and they're in great communities. And a lot of these people are socialized into thinking, well, they just got to leave and go to the big city for a job. And that was probably true 50 years ago, but it's just not true today. So you could be in a great place, you enjoy, your family's there, and you could build something based on a good education, the ability to innovate. Of course, you need access to tools, but mostly you need broadband, electricity, and transportation, and that could be anywhere on the planet. So what that does is it levels the playing field, and it should be resuscitating economic growth around the country, around these communities where you've got really great little colleges and universities. Every state's got a great research university. But Hawaii is really the metaphor of it for the rest of the country because people see us as physically isolated, but we're really not isolated when it comes to these kind of things. Because it turns out the rest of the world is the market. We think this is a great place for home. Home is about where your kids grow up, the families, and
values
and where you live. And people should be so lucky to live in a place that they want to be with people they really care about, in a culture that is meaningful to them. And if we're all so lucky, then the world's a better place.
So what examples can you give where either Hawaii has done that or, I don't know, what can other people learn about where we're at?
Well, the thing you brought up earlier with Zoom is a great proof point of how geography is no longer the center. And so you've got professional people working across the world where companies, it's like, was it, the name of the company, it just sold its downtown office in New York or something. You've got, you had at one point in history, the big tech companies were building these massive campuses and these big buildings to house all their people. You look at a place like Seattle, where Amazon is, it's congested. Cost of living is high. People spend hours and hours and hours in traffic. Where a lot of what they do, they might be able to do from a further distance away and maybe only come in periodically. And so it makes the need for that physical campus, makes it different. The recent thing in 60 Minutes, the news television thing, one of the last shows on major network television, just did a thing about this kind of New York City, right, where everything is predicated on business in the city, and people moved out. People are tired of the congestion, and they found that they could live in another part of the country and actually be really happy and productive. And so that's forcing the owners of the buildings to rethink what they use the building for, the physical plant. Turns out there's a need for affordable housing. So there's work going on into housing to repurpose these physical plants that used to house people for working offices.
Right, so it's a conversion from office space to residential towers.
Exactly.
Which we're doing here.
Which we're doing here. it makes sense. It's just a rendition of what goes on in a city. So some people may live and work there. Some people may come in periodically. Some people may call in from, a long distance or participate through Zoom or something else. And you see that going on right now. So I think the best proof point and example of this working is how companies are, there's some things in the press about some organizations are demanding everybody physically show up, and then people are leaving, especially in a work climate where unemployment is very low. So people have options. People are thinking of how they want to live and how they want to work, not just how they're going to work. And so I think that awareness is there. And on top of that is you've got this interesting kind of behavioral artifact with Gen Zs, where I think their families experienced what happens when the economy crashes and everybody gets laid off. When the major breadwinners for a family get laid off, everybody feels it. And I think what these kids are saying is, yeah, we want to work at a really good company, but we'd like to also have a life. And so finding that kind of balance doesn't mean people can't work hard and contribute. But the reality is, I tell people here that they spend a lot of their time here with people working on things that we all think are important, and they all deserve to have a good quality of life too. I mean, we think that's a really good thing, not a bad thing.
Yeah, so you think then, in our case, then geography can work for us because we have things that maybe people would gravitate to. You might want to live here.
Right. And one of the biggest challenges, of course, is the high cost of living, cost of housing. And I think there's ways to roll out policies to help begin to adjust that. But for highly educated people in the knowledge industry, those issues are less a barrier. They're always a barrier, but they're less a barrier because if you got a decent salary, you can then live in a more expensive place. And so pretty much every center of business, even before the pandemic and still, I think, after the pandemic, is still expensive. San Francisco, New York, Austin. I mean, Austin is interesting. So Austin, the cost of, we've done a bunch of things there, and I was there a few years, just before the pandemic. And and before that. So it used to be a place where you had a lot of all kinds of different people. It's kind of where, when I went there, I thought, well, this is where all the hippies went. They're hanging out in Austin. But that created this kind of diverse, interesting culture that led to the emergence of a tech industry, which created attraction for other businesses. It attracted young people, and it kind of spiraled. But people were interested in being there because of the culture and the things around it that made it kind of interesting. As it matures, of course, that may change if they don't manage the impact and from growth, which is always one of those issues. But for a place like Hawaii, there's people that would really love to be in a place with an awesome environment, and who are really excited about culture and the arts, and I think for people that like outdoor sports like surfing, there's really nothing like it. So I think for some people it's a perfect fit. Now for others, they might rather be up in the mountains, and that works too, right? But people have those choices where they didn't before.
Any other, final thoughts just about defeating geography?
I think the biggest impediment is that generationally you have people that remember the world when you had to live next to the factory or close to it. In Hawaii, we had a cannery not far from here. So they grew pineapples, and so people picked them, and then they canned them, and then they shipped them. And that was all done right here. But see, when it comes to things like electronics, semiconductors, chips, all kinds of things. Those are really made with a supply chain. There's so many examples. The recent article in The Economist with ASML that does all the semiconductor manufacturing, that's really the world's leader right now. They've got thousands of suppliers and other companies that work with them. And they manage that entire supply chain. That's more common. See, the idea that everything is sitting next to you is just not how the world works when it comes to real technology and real, complex and sophisticated machines and that kind of thing. So that, I think, is for younger people the norm, where older people hold on to those ideas that if the factory's not next door, then it's just not possible. But that's an obsolete idea. And so what's happening right now, which is kind of exciting, is huge globalization and moving manufacturing to China. The cost of labor in China has come up quite a bit as China, the population has moved largely out of where you had huge poverty and very low quality of life, maybe nice lives, but no access to making any money and huge population. So then what you've got is when the cost of labor goes up, then their competitive advantage is really not there like it used to be. And so what's happening is you have this huge onboarding, nearshoring in Mexico because it's closer. It's easy just to kind of access. Now you don't have the national security questions because now there's a question as the Communist Party runs China, what are they really after? Whereas Mexico looks pretty attractive. But see, you can take those supply chains and over time you can move them to Mexico, Vietnam, all kinds of places. That creates opportunity for all kinds of, all over the world. And what's happening there too is interesting is that it's not just cheap labor. They're putting machines that need smart operators. They need some level of education. So in Mexico, they're educating engineers. And they're actually now building the infrastructure to produce technology that's supplying the U.S. and the Western world, whereas a few years back they weren't. So that whole idea of globalization is this kind of active organism that's evolving.
And you create opportunities maybe closer to home or in areas that you may have overlooked before.
It's about managing the risk. So if you're in proximity and all things are equal, you've reduced the risk of making sure that things don't go south or fall apart, I should say, because it is south of the U.S. border. But you're managing risk and benefit. By operating it in China, you still would have to physically go to China periodically, but if you've got an environment that's less open to you coming in and out of the country and the free exchange of information, you just added risk. So it's really about risk and risk management and the return that drives it. You could argue the whole thing based on economics, I think, separate from just national security. But if you've got a national security overlay, say in China, where you're not able to move information in and out of the country because of the Communist Party has a policy, that adds risk. And if your product is a function of information that flows between the supply chain, you just added risk to the whole supply chain. So what you're going to do is move it out of that risk environment to a lower risk environment. But because their cost profile has gone up, it's not just cheap labor, because it's not so cheap anymore. And that's where China has to really focus on building their middle class and consumerism so that they can create and that's one of the things they're struggling with right now because Chinese like to save money.
But I can see, though, maybe in the case of the cannery where it's set, that in the other view, you almost have to be sitting at the edge of your seat because things could change.
Right.
And you have to adapt.
Right.
And you can't just sit back and go outside and go left and go to the cannery.
Right. But see, where we should be focusing, back to Hawaii, is if we looked at providing more resilient species of pineapple and did the genetics and the crop optimization so that it's nutritious, it's tasty, and it's resilient, because climate change is impacting agriculture all over the world. And so you've got to move entire wineries out of France. You've got to move, things are moving all over because of climate. You can deal with that with technology in ag. And that's an opportunity. Whereas if we want to go back and have the pineapple cannery again, it doesn't make sense, because cost of labor is way too high. Cost of land is high. Cost of transportation. Is it really cheaper to send it out of Hawaii? Now, locally, we might like to rather eat Hawaiian pineapple. But if you're doing it on scale, it might be cheaper to do it somewhere else. Whereas what we could do is focus on things like genetics and high-performance, sustainable ag that's exportable to the world that's suffering from climate impact. See, there's an opportunity right there that's less about geography, more about innovation and education, but still in Hawaii, still dealing with pineapple. It's just a whole different way to do it. And see, that's where some of the older folks want to go back to the pineapple cannery, which when I talked to my mother-in-law, who passed away a few years ago, it sucked. Working in the cannery. And for my other relatives who picked pineapple, it sucked too. They didn't really like it. So they're glad they're not picking pineapple or working in the cannery, because that was never any fun.
So it's like doing pineapple with what we're doing with corn seed.
Right. Exactly. And I think the whole field of agriculture and the impact of climate is creating huge opportunities. There's an area we would focus on here, I think, but requires educated people, a research university, willing to try experiments and create that capability, which is exportable to the whole planet.
So just don't limit ourselves to the cannery next door.
Right,
Yeah.
because we may say, geographically, if I can't see it in front of me, it must not be there. Whereas if you're producing seed or the genetics for resilient agricultural plants, that's exportable. So the idea of creating something that creates value is hard for people to get their head around, because they still want to sell a can.
Right. Well, we did that with shrimp.
Right. And see, that's a perfect example of Hawaii focusing on an export product that creates a lot of value, as opposed to trying to compete with cheap labor off of Thailand.
Right. So then if you have Vietnam and Singapore and everybody else knocking at our door.
Exactly. And that is the global economy that we should be looking at. And there is massive opportunity. Opportunity space for a place like Hawaii is huge. But the biggest limitation is, I think, ourselves.